Welcome everyone to our panel session. Our topic is whether the big issues of the 21st century still require, or do they require, a change in shareholder capitalism. My name is Antoinette Schoar. I'm a professor in finance at MIT Sloan, and I'm delighted to be able to host this outstanding panel. We have agreed that we will focus on two specific aspects of this question, and in particular issues that have been widely discussed as potentially problematic in the current governance system. First is the question whether our current governance system encourages short-termism rather than allowing companies to invest for the long term and invest in the future of society and our planet. And then the second related question is whether maximization of shareholder value over other stakeholder interests is the right way to think about the corporation, or whether we want to change this perception or kind of the practice of thinking about shareholder primacy. So I'm delighted that we have three outstanding panelists join me. I want to introduce them one by one, and then we'll go into the discussion. They kind of don't need introduction, but I will do it anyway. So the first one is Sanjay Bhagat. He's the professor of finance at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He has written widely on issues of corporate governance, executive compensation, and intermediation. He recently also wrote an article with Glenn Hubbard revisiting Milton Friedman's very famous and influential 1970 article on shareholder primacy, and we'll come back to this in our panel discussion, I'm sure. He has also extensive practical experience in the corporate world through his work at the SEC and also on several corporate boards and in startup companies. So welcome, Sanjay. Second is Martin Lipton. He is a co-founder, founding partner of Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz, which is basically the premier US law firms on issues of M&A transactions, corporate policy, and strategy. He famously also invented the poison pill. Marty has written numerous articles about corporate governance, the role of boards. He recently wrote a very interesting paper laying out a new paradigm of how corporations can start running themselves better for the sake of all stakeholders. And I hope we hear more of that as well. And he is also an adjunct professor at NYU's Law School, a trustee of New York University, a member of American Academy of Arts of Science, and a Chevalier de Légion d'honneur. So welcome, Marty. And finally, last but not least, is Luigi Zingales, who is the Robert McCormick Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. He's also director of the Stigler Center. Luigi has written very widely on the topic of corporate governance, political economy, the role of culture and trust in finance and economics. He has received numerous awards, more than actually I can list right now. Among them, for example, the Werner Serre Prize for the Best Young European Financial Economist. And Luigi also is someone who has translated his research into real action. For example, he serves on the Committee on Capital Market Regulation. He runs a podcast called Capitalism, as you see in his background. And he has written numerous books about how to translate financial ideas to a wider audience. Most recently, his book on a capitalism for the people, recapturing the lost genius of American prosperity. So let me stop here and let us get started with the panel discussion. What we have agreed upon is the following layout. We'll have each panelist give a 10-minute statement about their views up front, after which we will have a discussion among the panelists that I will lead, but I encourage everyone to please post questions, comments into the chat function, into the Q&A, and I will weave them into the discussion as we go along. And then at the end, we have about 15-20 minutes of Q&A with the audience. Depending on how this works out, we will either call on you personally or I will read out the questions again. So thank you very much. And without further ado, let me ask Luigi to get us started. We'll go in reverse alphabetical order.
Okay, thank you very much, Antoinette, for your very kind introduction. It's an honor to be with such a distinguished panel on a topic that I consider so important for all of us. And I think when we talk about the goal of cooperation, there's a lot of confusion. And I think it's important to distinguish three things. The first one, are we discussing from the perspective of the private optimality or social optimality? And I will elaborate in a second what I mean with that. Second, we need to distinguish between a incorrect identification of shareholder primacy with simply maximization of profits, even worse, short-term profits. And the third, the idea that one size fits it all. So let me elaborate on these 3 points. The first one is if we look from a private perspective, so if we are a group of people who want to create an organization, what is the most efficient way of organization? By and large, is an organization that gives shareholders control. And I'm not saying this out of theory, I'm saying this out of empirical evidence. Now, all of for us in this panel work for an organization that does not give shareholders primacy. So I'm not saying this is universal and applies to every in every field, but by and large, revealed preference suggests that people prefer this choice of organization over the others, even now when we have the public benefit corporation form available, so people can choose, still they choose to give shareholder primacy. So I think that that's a very important point that I want to stress. So the question more interesting is what it is for social optimality rather than private optimality. But and even when you have you observe co-determination, this is the case of Germany, you see it imposed by law. It's not a free choice of the individual. The second point is if individual gives shareholders primacy, what does this mean? Does it mean that you should maximize profits? In particular, you should maximize current profits? And the answer is, of course, no. We know that short-term profits are very different from long-term profits. And I think even Milton Friedman will feel very confident saying you should maximize long-term profits. In addition, I think that people don't only work for money, they have other objectives. And Antoinette asked me to give an example, so I will tell the story that I inherited from my father a small share in a small family farm. And as soon as I saw this, I thought, oh, this is an area in Veneto where corn grows very well, but corn is not very profitable. But where corn grows well, also marijuana grows very well. So as soon as marijuana would be legalized in Italy, I would like to grow marijuana and try to make a profit out of it. My sister is adamantly against that. And she will like fight to death to prevent this from happening. Why? Out of moral reasons. And she understands this is giving up some profits, but she's willing to do it because she thinks that this is the right thing to do. And I think my sister is not alone. In fact, I own some stock in Walmart, and I would like Walmart not to sell automatic rifle. Now, until recently, now they changed, until recently, they did. And when a large institutional investor asked to have a vote to decide whether they will be allowed or not, Walmart fought and won not to have this discussion among shareholders. I think that this is wrong. I think that this is not a business decision, it is an ethical decision. And the ethical decision should be left to the shareholders. And if the majority of shareholders decide one way, the minority can decide to leave if they want, to sell and leave. But I don't see why this should be decided by a manager or should be decided by law that you should not maximize anything other than short-term profit. After all, I think that nobody will want to be part of an IBM corporation who sold early computing machine to the Germans to help the Holocaust. And so we don't want to be part of today's Holocaust in a lot of other ways. So I think that the proper goal should be maximization of shareholders' welfare, not a maximization of shareholder value. This said, I'm very aware that this does not fix all the problem in the world. In cooperation, externalities are not a bug, are a feature. Why? Because the very nature of cooperation externalize some costs, special tort claimants. They have a limited liability of tort claimants, so they reduce their attention on tort claimants. So I think that we need to be careful on that. And I think that for many corporations, regulation works very well in dealing with that, not for all corporations. So I like to distinguish between Chuck E. Cheese and Walmart's, not because Chuck E. Cheese is so important, but Chuck E. Cheese is the example of the typical corporation that is not powerful at all. So if Chuck E. Cheese pollutes, is probably quickly caught and pay very dearly for that. If DuPont does, and I have plenty of evidence of that, basically get away with that for 30 or 40 years, and what he pays peanuts with respect to what he should have paid. If Chuck E. Cheese corrupts, the CEOs go to jail. If Walmart corrupts, see Mexico, they get away with that, maybe with like a nudge, a little nudge. And when Citigroup does not like a piece of regulation, they change it. And then they make the Secretary of Treasury their chairman and reward him very handsomely. And so large corporation can subvert the system in a way that small corporation cannot. So when it comes to large corporations that are too powerful to actually be left alone, I think we need to try to find something else. And this is something I've been working with Oliver Hart. We know that don't have the perfect solution, but our direction is to say we should probably go to a fiduciary duty to our society. If you are too big or too powerful to be left alone, you should at least put society first in your decision, because when you put shareholders first in your decision, you create such large negative externality that is very inefficient for society to deal with it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Luigi. Marty, do you want to go next?
Well, I'm sort of on the other side of the street, as you know, and I think that probably the first thing that needs to be recognized is what is the impact of the concept of maximizing value for the shareholders, because it pervades everything that a corporation does. If the management and the board of directors all feel that, yes, Milton Friedman had it right, our job is to maximize the value of the corporation for the shareholders, there is an attitude towards the operation of the corporation designed to, if not deliberately, but incidentally, minimize the interests of all the other stakeholders in the corporation for the benefit of the shareholders. Basically, I approach these issues more from a legal standpoint than from a finance or economic standpoint. And one of the problems of the Friedman concept of maximizing shareholder value was the impact it had in both the business schools and the law schools, and more actually in the law schools than the business schools, because economists, there has always been a significant group of economists who don't go along with the idea of maximizing shareholder profits. But unfortunately, the dumb law school professors took it at face value and said, yes, that should be the law. And indeed, in the most important state in the United States, the one in which most of the major corporations are incorporated, Delaware. The Delaware courts basically adopted a form of shareholder primacy, maximizing value for shareholders. And that has, in large measure, shaped the strategy of most of the major American corporations, pretty much up until 2008 to 2010, the financial crisis. But in the most important period in recent economic history, and so far as corporations are concerned, call it the period from 1980 to 2010, we witnessed in the U.S. Basically a shift in wealth, a shift in income of enormous proportions from working people working for corporations and the shareholders of corporations. We created a most inequitable and unequal society that has led to polarization and all of the political issues that are being debated today. And I attribute that in large measure, not totally, obviously, globalization, technological development, other things contributed to it. But I view the attitudinal design of maximizing value for shareholders at the expense of all of the other stakeholders in the corporation as the major contributed to that social situation. The problem really stems back to the early 1950s with the beginning of the institutionalization of shareholders. And I did graduate work with Adolf Berle in 1955, and he assigned me a thesis project of what impact the increase in shareholders by institutional investors, particularly pension funds, would have on corporate law. We didn't even call it corporate governance in those days. I failed. I wasn't smart enough to figure out how all this would develop, and I never did complete the thesis, but I've been interested in it ever since. And I became aware of the difficulty that stems from the focus on shareholder wealth beginning in the 70s and going into the 80s with the concept of shareholder primacy being used to support short-termism, activism, hostile takeovers, green mail, and so on, all of which contributed to the decline in the position of the average working person in the United States and to the financialization of the economy and the growth in the portion of the economy that is attributable to finance as against the portion of the economy that's attributable to employees and working people. I attribute the basic fall not so much to corporations. Almost every corporation I've ever been involved with, the manager of the corporation really had as its prime objective reinvesting the earnings of the company, paying dividends to their shareholders to keep them satisfied, but most interested in building the corporation and increasing its value over the long term, but feeling tremendous pressure from shareholders to do just the opposite. And that became totally exaggerated with the increase in index investing over the last decade, to the point where 3 index funds today control about 20% of the voting power in most of the major public companies. So in large measure, we have, in most cases, 10 to 15 institutions, including the 3 index funds, in a position to dictate the membership of the board of directors of a corporation. And unless these institutional investors, buy into questions of the environment, questions of equality, questions of diversity, questions of climate, which has really gripped the attention of people on a global basis. We have, on the one hand, shareholders who are pushing and using their power to push for maximizing returns to shareholders, often maximizing the immediate return, the short-term return, as against investing for the long term, and at the same time, exaggerating all of the problems, all of the environmental and social and personal problems of the people who are not getting a fair share of the economic world that is dominated by corporations. And as you mentioned, I've written a bit on these issues, and as a result of writing about it, I was asked in 2015, to prepare a paper for the World Economic Forum, basically to propose a solution to the problem, which was published by the World Economic Forum in 2016. We called it the New Paradigm, but basically said that corporate governance should be approached in a way in which corporations on the one hand and the investors in those corporations, the shareholders, engage with each other to come to reasonable judgment as to how the corporation should focus its strategy and what the principal avenues of concern from every standpoint are and how they ought to be resolved, and that engagement and that mutual understanding provided both the corporation and the shareholders bought into the same concept of fair sharing among all the stakeholders of the corporation and regard for the ESG issues, primarily the environmental, social, and employee issues. And that would resolve this and meet the coming demand for legislation. And that's sort of the background. I think we're in the last 8 months or the last 12 months or so, we have reached the point where either it's going to be the new paradigm or state corporatism. There's already been a strong movement over the last 10 years in Europe with the EU and the green taxonomy that they are pursuing for state corporatism. Statutes have been amended in France, the Netherlands, so on. So, and Elizabeth Warren 2 years ago introduced a accountable capitalism statute along this line. Mark Warner, the senator from Virginia, has prepared extensive legislation in this line. And my view is that it's either the new paradigm or it's state corporatism, or at least the initial moves towards state corporatism. And at the moment, I'm not sure that it isn't going to be state corporatism. I think the problems are such and so severe that they may not be capable of being dealt with by corporations, even if the corporations recognize the need for it. Some of the institutional investors, led in part by Larry Fink at BlackRock, have recognized it and are urging corporations to recognize the importance of the corporation adjusting to deal appropriately with stakeholders in ESG.
Thank you. Very interesting trade-offs, right? Society faces, and I think you're also highlighting how embedded corporate governance choices are in the political process. Let me turn to Sanjay, last but not least, for his view.
Well, thank you, Antoinette, for including me in this very, very distinguished panel. I sort of feel honored to be in the presence of Martin and Luigi. You know, they have sort of great insights already, much of which I agree with. So it's going to be a difficult task to, give some, I guess, characterization of some alternative viewpoints. But the larger question that we are dealing with today, goes back to, what is the objective of the corporation? And we are in the Milton Friedman school of thought that the objective is to maximize long-term shareholder value while conforming to the law of the land. So two points here. One is we're talking about long-term shareholder value. That becomes important later. And then number two, conforming to the law of the land. I mean, we're talking about antitrust regulations, environmental protection regulations, employment regulations. And Martin noted about the alternative paradigm, the stakeholder paradigm that was first, laid out in August 2019 by the Business Roundtable, sort of noting that the objective of the corporation should be to look out for the interests of the stakeholders, namely the employees, customers, suppliers, communities the company operates in, the environment, and lastly, the shareholders. So first, the good news. The good news is that if we have competitive labor markets and competitive product markets, then whether we use the shareholder value maximization principle or the stakeholder paradigm, managers of companies will make exactly the identical production, investment, employment, marketing, R&D decisions. So regardless of which point of view you ascribe to, from the viewpoint of what corporation will do, that'll be exactly the same. The key is competitive product markets, competitive labor markets. That's the real key to this. And we will get back to this repeatedly, hopefully, in our discussion today. So, why might this be the case? I mean, it's fairly easy to sort of, show as we have done, but very briefly, the argument is, for example, that if a company does not treat its workers right or compensate them fairly, the workers in a competitive labor market have alternative opportunities. And if a company develops a reputation for not treating its workers fairly or compensating them fairly, it'll have a difficult time to hire good workers to begin with. So this reputational effect has a long-term implication, as is the reputational impact of the quality of products and services that a company sells. So the long-term aspect, does create an issue within the corporate governance framework, but that can be addressed. So we want companies to focus on long-term shareholder value, but managers will focus on what their incentives are focused on. I think in many very well-known cases, their incentives have been misaligned, and that led to the episodes of Enron, WorldCom, Quest, the big banks circa 2008, more recently Wells Fargo. So what we are also recommending is that use the corporate governance framework to focus on the long-term incentive compensation of CEOs and board members. So, there's been a lot of discussion in the media about CEO compensation, but guess who sets the CEO's compensation? So you also have to focus on the compensation of the board of directors. And what we are recommending is that their long-term compensation should be focused on creating and sustaining long-term shareholder value. So what could that be? Well, their long-term compensation should consist only of restricted stock and restricted stock options, restricted in the sense that they cannot sell the stock or exercise the option for at least a year or two after their last day in office. So we are thinking of very long vesting period, where the vesting periods are anchored to their last day in office, not when they are issued, and we may have a chance to elaborate on this later. Now, the alternative paradigm, the stakeholder paradigm, it had several practical challenges. The first one is that it's internally inconsistent. GM in early 2019 had a choice between laying off thousands of employees, closing plants in Michigan, and retooling them to make electric cars that would employ only a few hundred. How do they make the trade-off between laying off thousands of employees, converting these plants to environment-friendly plants that manufacture electric vehicles? The alternative paradigm, the stakeholder paradigm, provides no guidance. At least if one were to look at the shareholder value maximization paradigm or hypothesis, there is some guidance to managers as to how they should move on this. Second, focusing primarily on non-shareholder priorities is counterproductive and short-sighted because it undermines employee and customer interests, the very stakeholders who are supposed to benefit from a focus on stakeholder interests. And hopefully we'll have a chance later in our discussion to explain why the stakeholder focus on non-shareholder priorities would be counterproductive and short-sighted. And third, the stakeholder paradigm leads to lack of managerial accountability. Almost any management expenditure of corporate resources, short of outright fraud, can be justified under the stakeholder paradigm. So let me try and conclude, at least at this point. Now, we have we note 4 policy recommendations. First, antitrust public policy should be vigorously enforced to maintain and enhance competition in product markets and labor markets. Number 2, management and board compensation should be reformed to focus on creating and sustaining long-term shareholder value. Number 3, Business Roundtable and their allies should avoid applying pressure on corporations to focus on non-shareholder priorities, because this will be counterproductive and short-sighted. Number 4, directors, and this is consistent with Martin's hypothesis, Directors may use their business judgment to allocate value to non-shareholder stakeholders if they believe that so doing will enhance long-term corporate business success and value. So why do we say that? This fourth point, I mean, besides being nice to Martin, that's not quite that, but the market underpinnings of the modern corporation and its freedom to engage in commerce and finance are in large part social constructs. So the right to private property, the right to pursue profits, caring about broader social concerns is not just an exercise in corporate social responsibility, as meritorious as that activity may be, but a realization that a lack of such concerns can weaken social support for corporations' economic foundation. So, let me try and give a larger sort of both a historical and a global perspective on this issue about the corporate, construct, what the objective should be. So, the building blocks of the modern corporation, you have the right to private property and the pursuit of profits. Now profits sort of, in this modern era doesn't sound like a good word, but it was these two basic principles that has elevated literally hundreds of millions of people in developing countries from abject poverty to quasi-middle-class status. So in China in the 1970s, basically they reformed their markets structure, and you had maybe 500 million people move from abject poverty to quasi-middle-class status. Same thing happened in India in the 1990s. So the basic constructs of the modern corporation has had probably the most beneficial impact on the human condition. And that is something we have to keep in perspective. When people are pushing back on the corporation, it may be the only it may be the only economic engine that has had such a positive impact on so many people. So I will leave with that. And again, Antoinette, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you to all of you for your first statements. Let me pick up on something that Sanjay brought up, kind of in his remarks. So, kind of, and that often gets repeated, I think, in governance and in the stakeholder debate, which is, kind of what's wrong with the idea that, shareholders will, in a way, incorporate a lot of the preferences and objective of, say, workers, of their customers, in order to maximize long-run profits, because you can only operate if your customers actually want your products and your workers want to work for you. So, kind of where, and of course, right, I mean, this is in some sense, Sanjay already said it, only true if we have competition on those kind of product and labor markets that allows, for workers and people to choose their products. What I wonder is, kind of say under the framework, Luigi, that you have proposed in stakeholder and shareholder welfare maximization, how would this address, kind of this actually very fundamental question about, kind of how these trade-offs are optimized?
So I think I failed in my first round to explain or to make very clear the distinction between if you look from a social perspective or from a private perspective. So if I start a business, as Sanjay said, I need to take care of my workers. I need to take care of my customers. My role is not to minimize where they are, like Martin said, because if I do that, I'll be out of business pretty soon. So I need to take care of their needs. The only question is, at the end of the day, if we make a decision, who is going to pay the cost of that decision? And in that, I think that Milton Friedman was absolutely right. You don't want to have taxation without representation. The shareholders, if the shareholders decide to donate to a charity, they decide taxing themselves, and so they should be represented in that decision. It's very easy for the workers to come in and say, I want a donation to this particular union, because they don't pay the cost of that. So in that sense, unless there are some externalities, and this is the point, I think that this is the right solution, with the understanding that not only money matters, that people have other preferences, okay? And I'm not saying that the preferences of the shareholders are more important than one of the workers. I'm just saying that generally we think that preferences should be decided at a political level, but if you decide with private money, at least you let the people who pay for it decide. It's just nothing prevents the workers or the customers to make a decision and say, you know what, I'm going to be paid $100 less per month if you donate this money to this particular association, or you from now on you produce a cleaner version of gasoline. And I think that some workers do that, and we know that in some industry workers are paid less because they accept to behave more ethically. Martin can confirm that, but in some law firm, the lawyers who want to defend tobacco companies make more money than the lawyers who don't want to defend tobacco companies, because defending tobacco companies is pretty disgusting. So people sort of pay a compensating differential, and but that's a choice, okay? And they have influence. Why? Because they can withdraw their labor in the same way in which customers have influence, because they can withdraw their purchases. The difference with shareholders is once they've given the money, they cannot withdraw that money ever, okay? And so I am concerned, like Martin is, about inequality, all these things. This stuff should be decided at the government level. I think that the biggest impact on inequality has been globalization, has been opening up to China too fast. All decisions that be taken at political level, not at the firm level. And I suspect, I would like to know Martin's view, but I suspect that in businesses like law firms, wage inequality has increased as much as in corporate firms. If you take the pay of the top lawyers with the pay of the janitors of the law firm, it's probably larger than the difference between sort of most firms. So it's not just the corporate form that is penalized, is the entire economy that went in that direction. If we want to fix the economy, we need to fix the political governance. This is where I'm worried, and this is where my trust in sort of in the corporation ends, because corporations have excessive influence on the political governance. And this is where I want to put a limit, because Milton Friedman will say you maximize profits conditional on following the rules of the games. Unfortunately, these guys don't follow the rules of the game. They make them, and they make it to their advantage and disadvantage of everybody else. That's the problem we need to fix. And I think that this has nothing to do with the stakeholder debate, is with the governance debate, which in my view is the real debate.
Martin, do you want to?
I think we don't have that much disagreement among ourselves. I think depends on how you describe it. My view is that the purpose of a corporation is to have sustainable long-term growth in value. That's the objective. The objective is not to maximize value for the shareholders. Indeed, I think it's the legal objective of a corporation. Management and directors of a public corporation have a duty of loyalty, not to the shareholders. They have a duty of loyalty to the corporation as a corporation. And that you can't operate a major corporation without taking into account the interest of the employees, the interests of consumers, the interests of suppliers, the interests of the communities in which the corporation operates, and so on. There's no great difference in how a board determines strategy and manages risk. It has to be kept in mind that if not the principal, a principal obligation, responsibility, duty of the board of directors is to be aware of the risks that a corporation faces and to mitigate or otherwise eliminate risks that they become aware of. So together with management, the board of directors determines the appetite of a company for risk, and then the board has an obligation to be sure that the company has a reporting system that elevates to the board material risk that is in danger of being violated or causing a problem, and the board then has an obligation to deal with it. There's a famous Delaware law concept, the care mark concept, which we lawyers like to toss around, but all it says is that you better make sure you have an enterprise risk management system that brings risk to your attention. And when you see a bad risk, you better deal with it. And obviously, not having appropriate employees, not providing value to customers where you're going to lose them, having supply chains that use slave labor are all issues. Digging a mine in religious areas in Australia that ignore the indigenous people. All these things are business decisions. They're no different in even if you're trying to maximize shareholder value, you have to take all of these things into account. But my view is that it required that there were only really two choices. Either you look to government for dealing with most of these things, or you look to engagement between corporations and the investors in the corporations. I think that market capitalism, which involves engagement, bargaining back and forth, is the most likely system to lift people and provide good economies on a national and global basis, and that we should try to achieve that. The UN, with its responsible principles of responsible investment, the World Economic Forum with the Davos 2020 manifesto, the business round, all of them are in the same place. And it's not that difficult. Sanjay mentioned adjusting executive compensation to promote long-term investment. Yes, that's a key element Aspen Institute has come up recently with proposals for. I'm not saying it's the best approach or the only one. There are a number of approaches to achieve it. I don't want to keep going on, but to mention one other thing that is totally misunderstood. There have been a number of complaints about companies that have been severely affected by the recession lockdown that has followed the coronavirus pandemic, that they continued dividends or paid some people when other people were furloughed and so on. These are business decisions, and if they're made on an honest consideration of what's best for the corporation, if reasonable business judgment is exercised, it may not be the right decision in retrospect, but legally there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. That's the right decision. And indeed, we delegate to a board of directors the power to make these decisions. We've never thought up of a better system than having a board of directors selected by shareholders. I believe in it. I think it's the only system that really preserves non-governmental control of corporations, and we should continue that system and accept its ups and downs.
Thank you. Sanjay, did you want to chime in?
Yeah. Thank you. So we've been talking about some, I'd say, very larger social issues, climate, environment, social justice, gun control. So, I mean, these issues are extremely important and very, very critical in sort of the debate we have today. But, we have to talk about the limitations of corporate power. So corporations can impact the behavior of the employees, customers, suppliers, and some very, very large corporations, can really, they have millions, if not billions of customers. So they can really be impactful, but they cannot impact citizens who choose not to be their employees, customers, suppliers. The larger social issues we are talking about, especially having to do with social justice and gun control would be another example. They would need compliance from most, if not all, citizens. Only the state's criminal prosecution and legal coercive powers can lead to compliance by the broader citizenry. So if you think about even the smallest county in the country or the smallest township, they at some level have more power than Google or Microsoft or Facebook. I mean, they have the power of criminal prosecution and legal coercion. And sometimes you need that for the issue that we're talking about. Environmental regulations, gun control. I mean, again, go back to that, but there are other social justice issues out there. So that's the limitations of corporate power. And, I like Luigi's and Oliver's idea about shareholder welfare maximization, which basically is the, underlying economic argument as to what we should try to do. And then we sort of translate that into shareholder value maximization. And I sort of keep going back to thinking about shareholder welfare. It has a lot of appeal, and I think it makes a lot of sense at some level. But there are some serious concerns about how do you aggregate shareholder preferences. So, some shareholders may like companies to be more responsible on gun control issues, on climate, or what have you. Other shareholders may have different preferences. We know that foreign institutional investors, they vote much more actively than US institutional investors on climate change issues. The one share, one vote corporate democracy framework allows wealthy investors greater voice. this exacerbates the current concern with income inequality and unequal voice. Of course, we have the well documented issues in corporate finance on shareholders choosing not to get informed or not vote. And then with regard to climate change, which sort of comes up repeatedly in the ESG discussion. So significant impact to combat climate change, they require public policy changes in the United States and abroad. So yes, shareholder resolution may impact some US corporations' behavior, but that may have very minimal impact on US public policies and even less impact on public policies of other countries abroad. And unless you can impact that, sort of this notion that shareholder resolutions in US corporations will have any measurable impact on climate change, I think is not persuasive. And, the shareholders, their motives are honorable and magnificent in some ways. And sort of I'm reminded of this, French army general who's watching the charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War, and his remark was, it is magnificent, but this is not war. So back to you, Antoinette.
Sanjay, our friends in the UK, of course, have the institutional investors created this investors forum, which basically exists to get a consensus of where the principal investors stand on an issue, and once that consensus is achieved, turning to the corporation to try to get the engagement to agree on the consensus view of the shareholders. So it within this concept, you can resolve differences of view among principal shareholders with respect to either ESG or stakeholder issues of one kind or another. There are means of resolving that issue.
If I may say, Bhagat, I think Sanjay, you're absolutely right that there is an aggregation problem, but this aggregation problem exists even today. It's just resolved in the most brutal way that anything other than money does not matter. So the same aggregation problem that I have in my family farm, in which my sister wants to do one thing and I want to do another, is resolved by saying my sister has no right to say anything except money. I don't think that that's necessarily the optimal way, and we need to find a solution. And I think that actually the solution is not that complicated, because we have now, as Martin said, the market is dominated by institutional investors. And if institutions were more transparent on what they're going to vote and how they're going to vote, we can choose with our feet. And if Vanguard is too aggressive on their environmental policy, I might walk away and go to BlackRock and vice versa. So that provides an enormous opportunity to convey our desires to the final company. So I think is a great opportunity to have an impact.
No, I agree with you that institutional investors, and I think to Martin's point, I think is excellent. In UK, this movement for getting the institutional investors to have some congruence on ideas on these important social issues. I think that's a step in the right direction. So the question is, so if the institutional investors have agreement on some set of objectives, why do they not go through it more directly, i.e. have a say in the election of the corporate board of directors? Because once you have directors that are elected, or where they have more, where they try to exercise their voting power, the directors are the ones that, can more sort of in the corporate framework, make the trade-offs between the social issues that you want to focus on and long-term shareholder value, or within that same framework. And so, I'm all for investors being more engaged, but I think getting them engaged in the corporate governance framework, where they take a more active role in the election of directors, that might be more effective.
Actually, I'm
Well,
worried about that.
They are playing quite a role.
And I'm worried about that role, because they might actually induce corporation to collude. This is a common ownership problem. They might induce to maximize joint profits, which means to collude. So yeah. I think that the accurate thing to do is they should vote on shareholders meeting, because this is transparent. So they cannot vote on a proposition to collude, because that's against the law, but they can vote on a proposition to reduce gas emission, because that's not against the law. So engagement, yes, but transparent engagement.
I agree. I mean, let me, however, kind of be devil's advocate and ask you all. I mean, kind of, it sounds like such a wonderful, appealing solution that we give, in a way, a market for ideas and for stakeholder value on top of shareholder value. But if you think about, in the world, there might be people and shareholders with different preferences, and some people have preferences, like your sister has preferences for caring about kind of social issues or societal issues, but other people don't, right? I mean, in some sense, right, to riff off of Madison, right, if society was made up of angels, we wouldn't need governance, right? So the issue then is, what if we have actually people who indeed only care for, say, profits, and do not care for any other stakeholder values? So then if you leave this to a completely open market, maybe you would have self-selection of the worst environmental or social offenders being invested in by the people with what we might think the worst preferences. But then, you would basically have the corporations that might need the most active shareholder engagement actually seeing these shareholders leave. And then, right, we in aggregate, we're not achieving the overall preferences of society. Have you seen, say, Mari, you were mentioning Europe, but have you seen any regulation that can actually help this market for stakeholder values?
This is to Marty or to me?
To both of you.
Okay, so why don't I start? I think that the problem is very simple. If you don't divestment can be dangerous, because then you can have the situation you described, that all the oil companies are run by the Koch brothers. So that's the worst possible situation. If you don't divest and you engage in the company you normally invest, this combined with diversification, so we are stuck with the index. Most of us, we are stuck with the index anyway. So we own Walmart, we own Exxon, we own all these companies, whether we like it or not. At that point, we better vote. And in the recent paper with Eleonora Burkhardt and Oliver Hart, we showed that if you were allowed to vote, actually you would vote for the right thing from a social point of view. So this is the ideal solution, given that we are in any way highly diversified.
I mean, I think the question of divestment as a solution is just not a practical solution to say that investors should leave one company and go to another if they're not happy with the business strategy. I think any company that develops a business strategy that flies in the face of what its investors would like to see is obviously looking for difficulty and is going to get it. there may be 5% of the companies out there that don't follow a reasonable type of shareholder engagement program. Obviously, some companies put a lot more into it than others. Larger companies have significant departments to deal with it and so on. The real key to having a smooth understanding is that the companies not refrain from discussing their strategy with the investors, and the investors not hesitant to express their views. Ultimately, it's up for the board of directors of a company to decide, and if the investors don't like the decision, they can vote to change the directors. It's not a very practical way of dealing with it, but that is the ultimate. On the other hand, here we have several organizations, the Council of Institutional Investors, ISS, Glass Lewis, who quite vociferously expressed the view of institutional investors as to these issues. So there's no real doubt as to where people stand on the issue. There is always some question on the part of investors as to whether the company's strategy within the confines of its overall objectives is the right strategy, and that gets debated. The speed in which things are dealt with. Are we going to get to zero carbon in 2030, 2040, 2050? How are we getting there? Different companies, if you look at the major oil and gas companies, there's a dramatic difference in how each of them has dealt with the climate issue and what's happened to the stock of each of them. In many cases, the stock is down by 60, 70%. In other cases, the stock is down by 30%, depending on how the market reacted to their policies with respect to climate. And a number of companies that said, we're the biggest or the next to the biggest or one of the 5 biggest and we'll do it our way, found that that didn't quite work. So as a practical matter, shareholder views are reflected by in-company strategic business decisions. And there has, in the past half dozen years, developed a major, in the 1 to 2 trillion area now. I think it's about $1.5 trillion of assets under management, of companies, of investors who are investing for impact, ESG impact. One of the leading activist investors, Jeff Ubben, left a Value Act fund and created the Inclusive Capital Partners Fund, which is designed solely and only to invest in ESG and stakeholder situations where they want to work with management in adjusting strategy in order to improve the profitability and acceptability of the company. I think it's early days to determine whether it's a successful strategy or not, but it's certainly a popular one today. And within the past month, we had Pope Francis, I shouldn't say bless, at least approve the Council on Inclusive Capitalism and express his support for it. I mean, the market as such, the overall market as such, is functioning and functioning from a number of different directions. And the question is whether it can adjust itself without severe government intervention, or whether government intervention is necessary. Pretty interesting if you just look back at the US from 1929 to 1980. It's a fairly interesting story of the New Deal and government, so on. And in 1980, new administration comes in 1981 and manages over the next 30 years to basically tear down all of the government guidelines with respect to labor and healthcare and pension plans and so on, and creating the situation which we have today. There is strong thought in political circles that what we need is a New Deal. And I think in large measure we are seeing the recognition by the major corporations and the major investors that they would prefer not to have a New Deal. They would prefer to have a new paradigm.
Right. And I think, from my perspective, the appealing part of having something, that's not, kind of state intervention in corporation is, of course, that then corporations get and their shareholders get to choose the type of stakeholder objectives that they specialize in, where they're the best at, right? Because as you were describing, you can actually have a situation where then oil companies focus, say, on environmental policies and not necessarily, kind of on the whole gamut of things as a checklist that you just check off, but really don't make a lot of impact on. So, kind of, I think my big worry, that you see with lots of government intervention on achieving those type of kind of goals is that they are ultimately not flexible, and they might stymie innovation where we need it the most, right? Because we don't just want corporations to say, we check off, these type of measures of ESG, even when they have long been outdated, right? Because these are all technologies that are developing as we speak. And in fact, if you believe many people who are right now even, say, working on electrification or electric cars, we are so far from where the frontier will be in 10 years that locking in any technology right now would be a huge mistake.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. And look at what has been developed.
Right.
You have electric vehicles. You have solar power, you have wind power, major responses have been made to these issues. And I think we will always find that when there is an issue, there is a group, and maybe Harvard dropouts or MIT master's degree holders coming along with an appropriate garage to create a new great company. But all of this continues and should be encouraged. I think the last thing we want to do is discourage innovation and creation.
Right. Let me shift gear a little bit. Given that we are sorry. Okay, Luigi, go ahead. Luigi, you're muted. Luigi, you're muted.
Funny that I, from Chicago, have to remind you that sometimes we need the government, in a sense, when there is plain pollution. I think that we need government regulation to prevent pollution. And I think that a carbon tax would be very effective. And many of the corporations who are very active on ESG are also very active in lobbying against the carbon tax and making that impossible. So I think that the first act of corporate social responsibility of firms should be the one of stop lobbying and distracting the public and disseminating sort of false information about stuff like the cigarette companies did about the damage of tobacco, the oil company did about the climate change, and so on and so forth. I think that should be the first order of corporate social responsibility. Then we can talk about the rest.
That's actually Luigi's point is very important. So, what studies have found is that greater lobbying expenditures by firms within an industry leads to greater industry profits and decreased entry by industry newcomers. So that decreases the level of competition within an industry. And this decrease of competition is neither good for the customers nor the employees. So, what do you do about that? I mean, companies at the one hand are lobbying for, regulations that benefit the incumbents. I mean, that's, Stigler's capture hypothesis in action there. So I don't know if there are any sort of corporate governance antidotes to that. What we need here is a more vigorous enforcement of antitrust laws, both by the Department of Justice Antitrust Division and by the state attorneys general. That's where the power to prosecute antitrust behavior resides, and that's what ought to be done. I mean, I don't know, of any corporate governance, method or paradigm where you could address. I think lobbying is a serious problem, and lobbying in the context of changing the rules of the game. And that's where, I think we have to be forthright and say, look, this is where public policy matters, and we have to have the Justice Department and the state attorneys general be a lot more vigorous.
It's not just anti. Okay.
I don't think there's any dispute that we need guardrails. That clearly pollution, antitrust, their guardrails are necessary, and they have to be enforced and so on. But I'm much more interested in flexibility between the guardrails. But I'm certainly not opposed to the guardrails. I'm actually quite in favor of them.
Yeah.
But the first guardrail is some limitation in the influence, the political influence of corporations. And given the Supreme Court decisions, this cannot come, at least in our lifetime, probably in our children's lifetime, from the political side, must come from the corporation side. So the first thing the corporation should do, and shareholders should vote in a corporate meeting, is a ban on lobbying, a ban on revolving doors. Revolving doors are very convenient for a corporation, but are distorting tremendously the system.
But
I agree.
I agree too. I just don't, is it kind of how to say, realistic to think that at the corporate level that could happen. I think, for an individual corporation, it would almost be a violation, and Marty will know this better, but it sounds like a violation of the fiduciary duty of the CEO. If the CEO said, oh, my corporate social responsibility is to not, make sure that, we are competing, or changing the legislative environment in a way that helps us. So I wonder if this is exactly a place where institutional shareholders could make a big difference, not in colluding, but in actually encouraging better enforcement of anti-lobbying, of, kind of indeed antitrust policies and so on.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a brilliant idea. We should tell Martin, who is friend with Larry Fink, that he should tell Larry Fink to make this his new campaign. His new campaign should be, I stop lobbying, and I vote for every piece of proposal that disclose lobbying and reduce lobbying by the firms I own. I think that should be the 2021 campaign of BlackRock.
Sure, Larry would agree with you, Luigi.
I actually think he would indeed too, right? But I think, kind of, I'm not sure why you say, Luigi, in our life, I mean, kind of in some sense, I think Sanjay has said this in some of his writing before, and I will parrot him now, but kind of, it seems we can't hope for corporations to do, or large shareholders to do all the work that the voters also should do. So, kind of, if the electorate was actually more cognizant of these kind of issues and was pushing more for it, in the end, politicians respond to these things too, no?
I completely agree. The problem is that in the United States, after Citizens United, basically money by corporation is free speech. So unless you overturn that decision, and first of all, it's not my role in front of Martin Lipton to talk about these things, but I don't see this coming anytime soon. And I think that there's nothing that politicians can do. We are in a really corner, and I see an action by institutional investors as the only way out of this corner, at least in the near term.
No, I think, that exactly, what Antoinette was saying is that, the problem we are talking about, a very serious problem. Lobbying, I think, is a very serious issue. And then it kind of goes on about, climate and social justice issues. It kind of impacts that. The issue is, what's the right or the most effective forum to address this? And I think public policies ought to be addressed in the political arena. And just because, the political arena is difficult to, have them do something does not necessarily imply that the corporate governance arena has become the more appropriate. I mean, I think, as you're rightly pointing out, I think Antoinette is right, is there may be some violation of fiduciary duty if companies voluntarily say we will stop lobbying. But if the antitrust departments of the Justice Department and the state attorney generals, take their charge of antitrust more seriously, I think that's the proper mechanism we have in our system to address this.
So we have here the legal authority for once. So let's ask the legal authority. Can anybody sue a CEO because he says, I don't want to lobby the company, even if this decreases profits?
Martin, this question was aimed at you.
Martin, can you hear us?
Will you repeat it?
Yes. So imagine that a CEO says, I stop lobbying. I know that this reduces my profits, but I stop lobbying because it's against my principles, or I don't think it's the right thing to do. Can any shareholder sue him or her for violation of fiduciary duty?
Yeah, not successfully.
Okay, good.
Okay, so at least that we put it to rest.
As you know, anybody can sue anybody for anything, but not successfully. No, companies, and it goes much beyond that, as you know, Luigi. All of these issues, corporate issues, if they're carefully considered by the board of directors, carefully considered by the management, they don't have a conflict. It can be dead wrong, just a disastrous situation, and they suffer a $1 billion loss. There's no legal responsibility for that. They have discharged their duty to do the best they can and act reasonably, and it didn't work. And some companies, the oil and gas companies, have had to make enormous decisions, multi-billion-dollar decisions with respect to investments and abandoning plants and so on. And the board gets all the information that it should have and talks about it. And they have advice from outside experts and so on. They make a decision. It's there's no way in which they're going to be held liable for it. It's when decisions are made without careful consideration, or decisions are made with individual conflict, that you create liability in these corporate situations. Interestingly enough, there has been a great deal of shareholder litigation, shareholders who are concerned about climate. This is the area where we've seen most of it. Shareholder litigation charging companies with failing to make proper disclosure of their carbon issues, and in some cases alleging that the failure to make that disclosure was a violation of the securities law, in that they were not disclosing that the stock was worth less than it was selling for if the public knew the bad decisions that they were making. And indeed, climate activists, not shareholders looking to make money by bringing lawsuits, but climate activists looking to induce companies to change their climate strategy, have brought a number of lawsuits of that type, as have attorneys general. The attorney general in New York brought just such a lawsuit against a number of the oil and gas companies. So there is significant extracurricular activity that is possible with respect to issues of corporate strategy or issues of investor stewardship. We are rather far behind in the United States in investor stewardship compared with where they are in the EU and in the UK. The Financial Reporting Council in the UK adopted new guidelines on stewardship, where the major investors are required to disclose their position on all of these ESG issues. In other words, what they expect from the companies they invest in with respect to these issues. That's something that might well be considered in the United States. a number of the major investors do have disclosed positions. BlackRock just a few weeks ago came out with its new investor stewardship positions, laying out in 8 verba exactly what their positions are. These number of the others are doing the same. But one thing that greatly facilitates engagement between investors and corporations is that both the corporation and the investor have made full public disclosure of what their position is. As the SEC this past year conducted hearings and has come out with some guidelines on what it expects with respect to disclosure of companies' positions on ESG and stakeholders. I use stakeholders to encompass ESG. ESG is in effect a stakeholder in the corporation, and there is considerable debate with respect to disclosure by companies of its how companies disclose what the sustainability accounting board thinks of them, or what the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. These have become delicate legal issues subject to SEC enforcement and subject to shareholder litigation. Nothing that a careful company can't easily comply with and deal with, but whenever you get these complicated situations, it is an invitation for litigation.
Right. I mean, so then the question is, kind of one thing is stewardship up front, right? In stating your policies and being transparent about those. Kind of we touched upon already this issue of measurement, however, in how well you're adhering to your stated goals, right? In the end, those intention statements will only be valuable if actually meaningful measurement of realization is also enforced. And kind of Madi, you mentioned that yes, shareholders can sue, or even activists outside the corporation can sue, but I wonder is this really the most efficient way of getting at enforcement, or shouldn't we hope for something like kind of say an accounting system or an SEC-like enforcement that actually holds corporations' feet to the fire of, if your stated stakeholder goal is indeed, kind of reduced carbon emissions, somebody has to go and measure this.
And Antoinette, yes, indeed. And the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum undertook this project together with the big 4 accounting firms to come up with a sort of consolidated set of metrics taking into account the SASB, all of these 4 and 3-letter organizations, and the S&P and the stock exchanges are going into the business of indexing of companies on the basis of their ESG status and so on. The EU has had this green the project going for several years now, and they publish their classifications of companies. I read just this morning that a bank in England is making loans now to individuals on the basis of making mortgage loans on the basis of the carbon rating of a residence. Or so how all of this is being done is a little beyond me in terms of finite definition, but whenever there's an opportunity of this type, somebody steps in to make a business out of saying, well, this is the appropriate measurement of your carbon discharge and so on. I'm not sure that the kind of accuracy we expect with respect to financial reporting can ever be respected with respect to non-number reporting. As you know better than I do, much of financial reporting itself has issues with respect to accuracy, even though it, in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. In any event, I do think it's reasonable to expect that people have a general appreciation of whether a company is making progress in reducing pollution of one type or another. Climate seems to be the principle, but it's a lot easier to measure how many plastic bottles you have not reprocessed into new plastic, but are floating in the ocean. Somebody's running around collecting those bottles. So, which is true, in fact. There is a huge business of collecting plastic bottles out of lakes and oceans and so on. So some things are measurable with, numerically measurable. Some things aren't. One of the things that Sanjay mentioned in connection with long-term investment that is easily measurable is incentives in executive compensation. Those are, as accurate as numbers are accurate. Other things are very, very difficult to mention, but I don't think the difficulty in measuring should deter us from seeking metrics that are usable in investors making, individual investors, human investors making determinations into which funds they will invest, and institutional asset managers and so on making decisions with respect to the corporations that they will invest in.
So one of the issues that has come up repeatedly, I think Martin alluded to that, and Antoinette, in your comment before that, about measurement of adherence to ESG principles. And I think we have a fairly active commercial market, and even by nonprofit organizations that have produced these ESG ratings for both private and public companies in US and abroad. I think the ratings, have become quite controversial. I mean, and there are several, several things to, I think, highlight. One is that, the ESG ratings, they reward companies with more disclosure. So even if a company actually is, involved in a lot of environmental violations, employment regulation violations, if they just disclose a lot, they will have a higher ESG rating than a company that is, let's say, more pristine, but doesn't disclose as much. Larger companies receive, in general, higher ratings. For example, we have Bristol Myers Squibb, market cap of over 90 billion, but is also involved in questionable experimental testing and violation of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. They have a much higher ESG rating than a company, Phibro Animal Health, market cap less than 2 billion, but has set the industry standard on responsible use of animal antibiotics. European companies receive, in general, higher ratings than US counterparts. Let me mention two companies: Volkswagen, involved in several environmental regulation violations, and Tesla, that has set the industry standard for electric car vehicles. Which company do you think has a higher ESG rating? Not Tesla. Then we talk about industry subgroups. So, you have ESG rating for companies, you also have ESG rating for industry subgroups. So let me mention two industries, utilities and healthcare. Guess which one on average has a higher ESG rating? Not healthcare. Additionally, I think the basic motivation for the ESG rating is to be appreciated and to be lauded. But the users of this, have to understand that they have great limitation, not just in their sort of not being accurate, but in their bias. And often the users will get exactly the opposite inference from what reality is. I'm not saying that it is not useful to focus on, whether a company's environmental record is improving, whether their employment records are improving or not. Of course, it's important to do that. But I'm not sure that the ESG ratings that we have so far, many investors may want to believe more from the ESG ratings than what they can possibly incorporate in their rating structure.
Well, maybe we should just rely on investors to do their homework instead of just taking whatever published ESG numbers are. It's the ISS question. Are you going to rely on ISS for all the information you need when you're voting on a board of directors, or should you develop a department of your investor business which is equipped with both people and library material to do the individual research? It's a question of cost. And investors or these investment firms are in business. It would be interesting in one of the business schools to do an analysis of the growth of the governance departments in the 20 largest institutional investors, and compare the growth over the last, start in 2000.
Right. I think, the issue, there have been some studies, Harrison Hong, for example, has done some work as well to show that right now a lot of ESG ratings or even corporate social responsibility investments are really a way to whitewash companies that indeed are doing very poorly on the factual underlying issues, right? And in some sense, people are still, I guess, corporations might still be hoping that individual investors don't either have the resources or the wherewithal to see beyond just, the stamp of that ESG number, right? And actually, one of my colleagues, Roberto Ricobont, has even shown that if you compare across the different ESG ratings that are out there right now, there's huge, Sanjay was saying that too, right? Very big differences in how different aspects are weighted and so on. But I think, kind of in some sense, it goes back, I think, to something that we also discussed before, given that investment management, asset management companies have become so big, right? They have much more of a stake in getting some of that governance right, because ultimately there is the fear of lawsuits, kind of activists actually then, kind of trying to how do I say, make them adhere to better information. So my hope really is that with a framework that encourages people to invest in that knowledge, we could push the governance of these stakeholder issues beyond it just being kind of namesake, right? And something that people just think comes for free, when in fact, people are not thinking hard enough. The reason why I'm saying this is, in my own work, right, I've done a lot of work on financial inclusion, and there are lots of companies that claim that they're doing financial inclusion, where indeed, all the governance is that they themselves count how many people they included, which, kind of, if you think about it a little bit, right, is really the worst way of doing that, that type of governance. And it's not cheap to do that right. And it's always easier to just make up numbers than to collect accurate numbers. That's why I think it's so important that if we want to really do something for the environment, for biodiversity, for all the different stakeholders, we need to be hard-nosed about how we measure the enforcement and how we govern the enforcement. Otherwise, I'm really worried it becomes, a charade of smoke screens that are being held in front of people without changing anything for the world.
True.
There's competition, among these four-letter organizations. They have not. There are. I don't have an accurate count, but there are more than a dozen organizations that have some credibility in this providing guides, numerical guide or one kind or another on ESG issues. But I'm fascinated, is it whitewashing or greenwashing?
That's right.
All of a sudden, whitewashing has showed up. For the last 10 years, it was greenwashing.
That's true. Whitewashing sounds really bad, especially if you think about, kind of the oceans, right? So I agree with you. I wanted to pick up on a theme that, kind of is coming up in the chat room, which, is more of a finance dimension, but, both, kind of all of you have emphasized the importance of choosing not just different stocks, but different asset managers. But there are some questions, kind of in the chat that are asking, there are, of course, tax implications of, say, divesting from one asset manager and into another one. So do you feel, is there a role for the way we think about, say, capital gains tax or capital gains tax incidences having to be changed so that, if, Luigi, you were saying, if I divest from Vanguard because I don't like how they vote on certain issues and go with Fidelity, but you might not be able to do that if that triggers capital gains tax.
First of all, on your pension money, you can do, because you don't have taxes, and for most people, that's the vast majority of the investment they have. So I think that's not a huge problem.
That's true. Even though, can I say, sorry to to
Oh,
be
please.
obnoxious, but in your 401k, you often don't have as many choices, right? You have a limited set of funds that your employer has proposed, and so you might not be able to choose as smoothly as you would like.
That is true, but I think that this is what, in my view, the family of funds should offer various alternatives, because the cost is trivial in the sense they don't need to manage the asset differently. They need to vote differently when it comes to shareholders meetings. So you can have a Vanguard green and a Vanguard I don't care, and is like perfectly the same return, and just at the moment of voting, you vote in a different way. So I think that that is relatively easy for companies to do. But you're right that when it comes to individual accounts, I think that you will have tax implications. I'm not particularly in favor of reducing the taxes for that reason. Doesn't seem like the right thing to do. So it is a cost of exiting if things are not properly. But there are a lot of new people who come in who can decide where to go, and so I think that will determine in part what institutional investor will do. So I think that is a big source of competitive advantage if there is this clear differentiation in terms of their governance structure. And I would like to add on the measurement part. I think that I'm very skeptical about all these measures. In part is because they are done by for-profit firms that can be dine and wine appropriately. So you don't know exactly whether, as Sanjay was saying, if you're big, you can pay better, and then all of a sudden you have a better rating. I'm actually much more a believer of measurement from the bottom up. I think that one of the big advantages of technologies today is that you can apply sensors at a very low cost. And so I think that if you have the community around that measures how much pollution you issue, that can be done at the community level, and that measure is more important than the ESG level. So I think that we need to push in that direction.
Right. Even though, what would I think this is the kind of place where actually the government framework could very much help, because if it's really about measurement, right, why do we have an EPA? Why do we have kind of regulations that we environmental regulations that we can measure? We can leave it up to corporation to define where on the scale they want to sit, kind of define which of the ESG measures they focus on the most, as we discussed with Madi before. But measurement per se, right, could still be done by regulators, no?
But so would you trust more a measure in the Cambridge area done by the EPA or done by the city of Cambridge?
Oh, but sorry, but the city of Cambridge is still a government. I mean, it's a.
I understand. I'm just trying to say that the more you bring to the community level, the more you bring to people who are affected by that pollution, the more likely it is that measurement is not corrupt. Unfortunately, the EPA does not have a great record, especially recently.
No, that I completely agree with. I think, Sanjay, you were going to jump in.
No, I mean, I think Luigi's point is exactly correct. I think on two dimensions. One is doing it locally. You're much better off. You get more. I mean, people that are being affected, have the right incentive to get those numbers right, and then using technology to do the measurements on a real-time basis. Again, it's sort of these, things, are doable and probably should be done. But, if what we are really concerned about is the carbon, or the carbon emissions in the environment, and then its impact on climate, it's an issue that involves both corporations within US and then abroad. And one might even say that what companies are doing abroad and what governments are doing abroad might have a much bigger role to play than anything the U.S. corporations can hope to accomplish. So, if I mean, that doesn't mean that we should not, we should not try to have U.S. corporations behave even more responsibly than they have been. But if the focus really is the global climate, I mean, by definition, it's global, and that's where I'm sort of, I'm not sure that shareholder resolutions, shareholder initiatives, even institutional investor initiatives is going to be institutional investors would be more effective than shareholder resolutions, but even they will not be very effective unless we get public policymakers of the large countries abroad on board. And that, I think, is more a policy issue than an institutional investor issue.
Right.
Yeah, but again, I think that if Exxon had not produced this information for many years, maybe we'll be in a different situation. So I think corporations have a pretty big responsibility in the misinformation that takes place. And American corporations, because of their size and because of their importance, even more so than others. They're not the only one, of course, but they're more than others. So I think that there is no doubt that we need to resolve that at the political governance level. But if corporations don't disturb, we're not trying to, at least they should not disturb. If they can help, even better, but at least not disturb.
Right. And the kind of the ultimate solution might need more players than corporations and shareholders, but that shouldn't get those ones off the hook either, right? So you have to start somewhere, I would imagine. Given that we only have kind of less than 5 minutes left, I want to just ask all of you, another question from the audience is, when we talk about long-term shareholder value maximization, which in some sense all of you, have kind of agreed is important to bring about, those policy change or those changes at the company level we discussed. But what do we mean with this? So how long-term is long-term? And in particular, kind of, it's also been pointed out that obviously different shareholders have different horizons just by the nature of who they are. And I want to even add, sometimes we have seen that maybe, top management has a longer horizon in the firm than the revolving door of shareholders. So, kind of whose, whose horizon are we talking about here?
So let me start, given this finance question, and the answer is, if the capital market works well, we shouldn't be affected by that. There is a thing called Fisher separation theorem that says that corporations should not be affected by the horizon of their shareholders, and they should not be affected because the shareholders can trade in the capital market and get consensus on the horizon on the capital market, and then the corporation aggregate this consensus and act accordingly. Now, this is easier said than done, and we know that there are a lot of pressure for short-termists, but I want to tell you this factor. That I was at a meeting with CFOs who have a degree from the University of Chicago, so it was a pretty big group of CFOs. And I asked, and I said, do you think that you have more short-termists in the stock market or with the private equity, if you're owned by a private equity? Now, I want to know, Martin, which one do you think they answer? Between the public market and private equity, which one is more short-termist?
I'm sure they said private equity.
Private equity.
Yeah, they went big time for private equity, which is interesting because you would, at least some of us would have thought that, they're concentrated, they are the right objective, etc. But the fact that they want to sell relatively fast, a large chunk, give them a shorter horizon. So I think that there's no doubt that there are pressure for short-termism. we face them at a personal level every day, every year, right? We like to improve the classes, but we're going to do next year. So I think that that's a common shortcoming against which we need to fight against. However, and this is where, since we're being a law fest, I want to point out also the difference. This is where I'm different from Martin, because Martin said at the beginning that the goal is preserve the corporation at all costs. And I don't have this view, and especially if you consider startups, many startups fail, and you need to recognize that they fail before you wasted all the money. So I think knowing also when to stop is very important. So there is short-termism, and there is also excessive or long-termism that you keep going without a chance. So I think that we need to balance the two extremes.
Thank you.
I don't think there's any disagreement there.
I agree.
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, you have to recognize that there are different external pressures for, if you're in the business of raising new money regularly for private equity deals, you need to show returns in the 2 to 3 year area.
Right.
You can't count on a 10-year
horizon, right?
Yeah.
We are out of time, and this was a great end, because in the end we ended also with governance, right? I think the one thing I want to say, which is efficiency in itself actually is also a stakeholder value, right? Which is kind of what we started with, and maybe we're ending with. So I want to thank you all for a really insightful and very fun discussion where at least I learned a ton. Thank you so much for being here. I hope, kind of the audience, even though you were not here physically and in person, enjoyed it as much as we did. And I wish you a good rest of the AEA meetings. And thank you again to my fellow panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette.
Thank you very much. You did a fabulous job of putting this together.